and do a quick introduction and first welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us, whether you're on Zoom or on Facebook. We regularly have a lot of people on Facebook. So if you're just watching us on Facebook and tuning in or watching us afterwards, thank you for joining us. My name is Rabbi Adir Glick, and this is a program that's sponsored by our synagogue, Temple Har Zion in River Forest, which is in the west side of Chicago. And I think one of the silver linings of this very difficult few months that so many of us, that all of us have been experiencing, but the silver lining is that we take a break from our regular lives and we start to think about those really important questions that we don't always have the time to think about in regular life. Questions about how we are with our families, questions about what is most important in life, and unfortunately also questions about life and death amidst all of this uncertainty. And as I mentioned just a little bit earlier before we formally began, I taught a class on Judaism and the afterlife a few months ago, and so many were speaking about how being raised in their synagogues, whenever it was, some of them were taught that Judaism does not believe in an afterlife, or that Judaism does believe in an afterlife but doesn't want to talk about it. But here are all of our superstitions and rituals surrounding it. And it's true, so many of our rituals, so many of our prayers that are beloved by our tradition are surrounding death, the Kaddish prayer and yard sites. And then we have this incredibly rich tradition in Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism, speaking about every part and trying to describe every part of that death experience, but also talking about how those experiences link into our regular spiritual lives. And our religion, like all religions, began with an experience of spirit. When God appeared to Abram, who would become Abraham, and said, "Leave your home and everything that you know, and if you follow me, then your life will be a blessing." And then a few hundred years later, 2 million people, Abraham's descendants, stood on a mountain and heard God's voice, and as one accepted the mission to be a kingdom of priests. And in that class of the afterlife that I taught, there were so many people who were talking about having experiences surrounding death, or with those beloved ones of theirs who are no longer with them, and how those experiences changed their lives, changed their very experience of life, spiritually transformative experiences. And one of the books that I read last year that I most enjoyed was Touched by the Light by Dr. Kason, who is with us today. And it was a book that spoke about spiritual experiences and near-death experiences very openly, and tried to make sense of how those experiences change our lives physically and spiritually and emotionally, and through a scientific lens, and to bridge that area where science regularly does not want to go, and nor does medicine. And with such interest in this topic, and with someone who has so much to teach and share with us, I decided it would just be a great idea to bring Dr. Kason to speak to our synagogue, especially at this time of uncertainty. So a very timely topic. I'm going to remove, let's see if I can. So Sheila, I'm just going to stop your sharing. There we go. And a more formal bio here for Dr. Kason. Dr. Yvonne Kason, MD, is the president and co-founder of Spiritual Awakenings International. She is the past president of IANS, the International Association of Near-Death Studies. She is a retired family physician and MD psychotherapist, previously on faculty at the University of Toronto, and an internationally renowned medical expert on near-death experiences and other spiritually transformative experiences. In 1990, Dr. Kason was the first Canadian medical doctor to specialize her medical practice in the research and counseling of patients with diverse types of STEs. And Dr. Kason is the person who first coined that phrase, spiritually transformative experiences, or STEs, in 1994. She has had 5 near-death experiences herself, 2 in her childhood and 3 in her adult life, as well as multiple STEs. She has published 5 books, her most recent, Touched by the Light, Exploring Spiritually Transformative Experiences. That was in 2019. She was recently interviewed on the Dr. Oz show and on Coast to Coast. Yvonne Kason lives in Toronto, Canada, and enjoys snowbirding during the winter months in Encinitas, California. So I'm going to keep everybody on mute for now, but if you do have any questions, you can put it into our chat, and those questions will build up at the end of the talk. We can begin to address them. And thank you everybody for coming, and what my great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Yvonne Kason.
Thank you, Rabbi Glick. I'm just going to start with a screen share. Hopefully this will work. Yep. So what I'm going to be talking to you about today, thank you for having me, let me first say that, is basically a very short summary of what I've learned about near-death experiences and other spiritually transformative experiences in 40 years of research. And this is who I am, Yvonne Kason. I am a medical doctor. You can see all my initials after my name. And I'm currently the president of Spiritual Awakenings International. I'm very proud of this organization. We only launched about 3 weeks ago. And invite you to explore that. I'll give you the website later. And I personally have had 5 near-death experiences and many, many, many spiritually transformative experiences. So what I'm going to be talking to you about today is based both on my research and clinical experience counseling thousands of people, but it's personal as well. It's not just my research and clinical experience, it's also personal. And this is my book, Touched by the Light, in case any of you are interested in learning more about what I'm going to be talking about today. So how did I, as a medical doctor, get interested in specializing in near-death experiences and other spiritual experiences? Well, of course, it was by my own spiritual experiences. And I look at it now in retrospect that while I was completing my worldly medical training, the higher power, Great Spirit, was giving me spiritual training for what my specialty was to be, because these things were happening to me while I was doing my medical training. In 1976, when I was a medical student, I had what I now know as a Kundalini awakening. Then in 1979, when I was a resident doing my family practice residency, I had a near-death experience in a medevac plane crash, followed by a psychic awakening just a few weeks later. So this is all during my medical training. I'm now going to talk for about the next half hour about my personal experiences, and then we'll go back to the screen sharing when I'm talking more about the content. So what happened to me in medical school? Well, in my last year of medical school, there was this a meditation course being offered at the university. And it was not being offered as something religious or spiritual. It was being offered that it was to help you be calmer when you're studying for your exams and help you to get better marks on your exams. So I took this meditation course. And because I was in my last year of medical school, had a lot of exams, I wanted to do well on my exams. And lo and behold, I discovered that I loved meditating. I felt like a duck being reintroduced to water, you know, that oh, this feels natural to me. This feels good. So I started meditating very regularly, about an hour in the morning, an hour in the evening. And lo and behold, about 3 months after I started meditating regularly, I was in a group meditation. And all of a sudden, I had this strong inner experience. And I heard this loud inner roaring or rushing noise, sort of like the roar of a waterfall. And I felt this rush of energy rush up my body and back, and it felt like rushed up through the top of my head. And then I expanded out of the top of my head. And what I think of as me was no longer sort of inside of my head or inside of my body, but I now seem to be up above my body and vastly expanded, that I seemed to fill this big auditorium that I was sitting in. But not only had I expanded, but I had sort of transformed, and I was feeling like I had become this force field of love. I was feeling this beautiful, incredibly strong love while I was in this expansive state. And I remember at the time, I thought that this is what everybody else was experiencing when they were meditating, and that I had finally gotten it right, you know, my technique, and this was the it experience that everybody else was having. So I just enjoyed it, loved it. It was just profoundly beautiful. And at the end of my meditation experience, it ended. And I never even told anybody because I was embarrassed. I was sort of embarrassed. Why did it take me 3 months to get my meditation technique right, that I was finally having the experience that I thought everybody else was having all the time? Anyway, I was disappointed when I wasn't able to reproduce this experience with the energy flow and the expansion and that feeling of love, which I now realize was a type of mystical experience and a Kundalini awakening. But back then I had no idea what it was, but I was focused on my studies. So I just sort of put that aside and I continued focusing on my medical studies, to be determined later what on earth that was that happened to me. Well, when I was in my residency, so I was already a young doctor and I was doing my specialty training, in March of 1979, I was assigned to a small community in Northern Ontario called Sioux Lookout. I don't know if anyone happens to know where that is, but it's quite a remote community in Northern Ontario. And on that day, I was assigned on a medevac of a critically ill Native Indian woman. And we were to fly her from Sioux Lookout in an airplane. It was a twin engine airplane called a Piper Aztec. So it was not a helicopter. It had like 2 propellers, one on each side, a small little twin engine plane. And we were to fly her from Sioux Lookout to Winnipeg, which was the closest, biggest hospital that had like an ICU and the more intensive care that she needed. And so in this little small plane, we had the patient in the stretcher. I had me as the medical doctor. She was intubated with one of those tubes into her airway. And so there was this bag called an ambu bag, and I had to be pressing that to keep her ventilated. And she had IVs in both arms. There was a nurse there looking after the IVs, and we had an oxygen tank. And then there was the pilot who was flying the plane. Anyway, to make this, we filled the plane. The plane was so small that the plane was full with us in it. This plane flew into bad weather. It flew into a blizzard. And they now said, because there was an inquest afterwards, that the crash was caused by the air filters of both the propeller engines freezing over because of the blowing snow and the cold. Anyway, the plane ended up crashing. And just because of time today, I'm going to be abbreviating the stories of all of my experiences. If you want more details, it's in my books, but I'm going to just be touching on the most important points today because of our time limitation. So the plane crashed onto the surface of a semi-frozen lake, which was Lake of the Woods near Kenora. And when the plane finished sliding across the ice, it finally came to a stop. And when the weight of the plane settled, it broke the ice and it sank. So I very quickly had to get out of the plane while the plane was sinking. The pilot, myself, and the nurse managed to get out, but despite all of our efforts, we were not able to get the patient out. And unfortunately, she drowned as the plane nosedived into very deep water. And then I found myself in open water in this lake with a large stretch of water. They say maybe it was about 200 yards between me and the closest land. And I was wearing a heavy winter parka and boots like, we do in the winter, but I was in the water and these were like lead weights pulling me down. And the pilot was screaming out, try to get on the ice, try to get on the ice, because going away from the land, there was ice, which we didn't know how thick it was, if it was thick enough to support our weight, which it was not, it turned out. But a voice in my head kept on repeating, swim to shore, swim to shore. And so I swam to shore. And it was a very long and a very, very difficult swim. Fortunately, I was a strong swimmer and I almost drowned on the process of swimming to shore. Plus, I was freezing to death. I was getting colder and colder and colder because this was sub-zero weather. And I went under a few times with lake water in my lungs. Somewhere in the process of swimming to shore, all of a sudden, I heard this roaring, whooshing sound again, very similar to what I'd heard in that, what I now know was a Kundalini awakening. I heard whoosh, and suddenly I found my consciousness whisked up out of my body, and I was no longer in my body. My point of perception seemed to be 20 or 30 feet above my body, and I was looking down. Now, it was more complicated than that because my body wasn't dead. My body was still swimming to shore. So it was actually like my consciousness was 2 places at the same time. And I compare it to a split screen TV where you have a big image where most of the image is, and then you have a tiny little image in the corner. So what had happened to me was most of my consciousness, like the big image, was up above my body now, 20 or 30 feet above my body, but there was still that little corner of my consciousness that was in my physical body that was still desperately, desperately, desperately trying to swim to shore. So then I rose higher. And I rose into this realm that was filled with light. I mean, the physical world was dark and stormy because there was a heavy storm happening. But where I went to was a place that was filled with peace, that was filled with light. But the most powerful thing about where I went to was the love. I felt profound, powerful, unbelievably beautiful love. It was the most profound, perfect, beautiful love I'd ever felt. I felt like I was home. I felt like this was where I belong. And I was just being loved purely to the center of my being. And when I was in this realm of light, the light was not like a glaring, blazing light. For me, the experience was a soft, white, diffused light. And the closest I've seen that's like this is if you're in an airplane rising, and when you're right at the top of the clouds, just before it breaks into the sunlit skies above, when the clouds are all glistening and there's this white, soft, diffused white light around you. That's what it was like for me in the realm of white light, this beautiful, soft, loving light. For an instant, I did see a face of light sort of as emerging from the clouds, and then it just sort of shifted back into the clouds. And I was just basking in this love. And while I was experiencing this incredible love in the white light realm, I also knew things. And not because I heard words or it was spoken, I just understood. I just somehow knew things. I absolutely knew somehow that this love that I was feeling was the love of the higher power, or what I call God. And I knew, I felt, I could sense its vastness, that it interpenetrated and underlay all of creation. And I also could glimpse, understood, knew its incredible intelligence, vast, vast, vast intelligence. And you know, this experience I was having of the higher power, or what I call God, was not at all what I had been taught in my church of childhood that God would be like. I mean, I had been taught that, you know, God was like an old man with a white beard sitting on a throne that would be judging you, you know, have you been good? Have you been bad? And that was not at all what I was experiencing. I was experiencing it more like some of the Eastern concepts of a universal force, loving, intelligent, that's interpenetrating all of creation. Anyway, I remained in this realm of love until my physical body was resuscitated. It took great effort, but I did finally make it to shore through the grace of God and through coincidences, if you believe them. There was a helicopter nearby when normally there would never be a helicopter nearby, and it managed to find us, and it managed to rescue the three of us that survived before we died from the cold, because we were freezing to death, and brought us to the local hospital, which was Kenora Hospital. I remember floating above my body and watching as they landed the helicopter on the driveway of the hospital, and then the emergency staff came out with their little trolleys, you know, and they laid me on one of these little emergency room beds, and they wheeled me into the emergency room. And then I was watching from above as a nurse was trying to take my temperature. And I remember watching her, she's looking at the thermometer and she was talking to the other nurse. I'm not getting a reading. She couldn't figure out why she was not getting a reading on the thermometer. But the reason was that I was so cold. I was so hypothermic that my body temperature was below the bottom reading on the standard thermometer. And then I was really surprised to hear somebody say, boy, could I use a hot bath. And then I was really surprised to witness that those words had come out of my body, because I hadn't thought of saying those things. You know, I had not consciously said those words, but they came out of my mouth. And then it turns out that is exactly what my body needed. It needed to be rewarmed very rapidly, and a hot bath would do that job. And so the nurses then spoke to each other and said, gee, maybe that would help them. And so they wheeled all of us down to the physiotherapy department. They finally took off my ice encrusted clothes, put me in the hot whirlpool bath, which reheated my body. And it was while I was in that hot whirlpool bath heating up that I felt my consciousness re-enter my body. And what it felt like was, whoosh, like I imagine how a genie would feel being sucked into a bottle. I had been in this big, expansive place up above in the light, and whoosh, it seemed through the top of my head, I was suddenly sucked back into my physical body. And then I was back. And then I knew that I was going to live. And then I knew that in this divine drama that the higher power was unfolding, that in this particular chapter, I was meant to live. And this experience changed me profoundly. When I came back, it was like I was drunk with love. I was just, it's like some of that love that I experienced on the other side came back with me. And, you know, I had been feuding with my father for several years before my near-death experience. That happens with young people, you know, teenagers, young adults, you get into conflicts with your parents. I hadn't been speaking to my dad because I was mad at him. And after this experience, it's like my heart had just opened, and all that nonsense that had been so important to me before, that this grudge I had against my father, it was just gone. And I called my dad up and I said, Dad, I love you. Let's be friends. And we reconciled, and we had a wonderful 7-year relationship, a loving father-daughter relationship, until my dad died 7 years later. And I look at this as one of the big blessings, gifts that I got out of that near-death experience. Nothing changed about my father. He still had his same quirks and habits that used to make me so angry. It was me that had changed. These things didn't matter to me anymore. I loved him, and that was all that really mattered. And this experience also completely made me lose my fear of death. I thought it was a joke to be afraid of death, because it's actually much nicer on the other side. And then the other thing that very strongly it did to me is it made my spiritual views much less dogmatic, because it became very, very clear to me from this experience that there is just the one same spirit, whatever name we happen to call it by the culture or religion that we were raised in. It's the same one spirit. That it gets it, that we all have partial understanding, but it's that all, I could see the unity of the different religions as if they're trying to climb the same one mountain by different paths going up the different sides of the mountain. So this changed me tremendously. Now, much to my surprise, a couple weeks after this happened, I had what I now know was a psychic awakening. I was driving home, driving to visit a friend one evening after work, and I was stopped in an intersection at a red light in my car. And all of a sudden, in my mind's eye, popped this glistening white visual image of my friend's brain covered in pus. And, you know, somehow I knew it was my friend's brain. How I knew that, I cannot explain, but I did. And to me, as a medical doctor, the symbology was perfectly clear. I knew it was the symbol for meningitis. And sure enough, when I went to my friend's house, I arrived there maybe 5 or 10 minutes later, and I, you know, sort of sheepishly asked her, how are you feeling? And turns out she had a headache, she was sick. And yes, later on that day, she was diagnosed with meningitis. So that was my first clairvoyant experience. And then I started having more psychic experiences after that. So as a young medical doctor, first I went to my doctor friends to try and ask them, if anybody had heard. I talked only about the near-death experience. Some of, what I now know was the Kundalini, I now know was the psychic awakening. It didn't feel safe to talk about that, but I was talking to my doctor friends about what happened in the plane crash. Had anybody ever heard of such a thing? Does anybody even have a name to call this experience? And all my doctor friends, they knew I wasn't crazy, and I had a very good reputation, and I ended up with, teaching at the University of Toronto for many years. And that everybody came up with a hallucination theory. So all my doctor friends called it a hallucination, that I was hallucinating because I had a low blood sugar, that I was hallucinating because I had an electrolyte imbalance. And that just did not feel right in my heart, because this experience had such a positive effect on me, had such a positive spiritual effect, such a positive psychological effect. This was no hallucination, and I could remember it perfectly clear, and I can still remember it perfectly clear now, over 40 years later. This was no hallucination. So this started me as a young doctor into my double life. I was in the closet. I was a closet mystic. So on the outside, I was doing my professional career, and I was teaching at the University of Toronto, and I was practicing medicine, and I had a very successful career. But in the closet, I was a secret mystic. I was having these powerful experiences, and I was researching, all different types of spiritual experiences, mystical experiences, near-death experiences, Kundalini, which is called Holy Spirit and Dumo fire in other traditions, a psychic phenomenon. I started researching all of these areas in my private part of my life. But then more and more and more people came to see me in my practice over the years. It seems somehow they heard about me, that, oh, there's this medical doctor in Toronto you can go and see, and she's had some of these spiritual experiences too. She won't automatically think you're crazy. So over the years, more and more and more people in confidence, in the confidence of a doctor's office, were telling me about these powerful experiences they'd been having, mystical experiences, Kundalini awakening experiences, psychic awakenings, past life recall. And then it all came together in 1990, that this was more than 10 years now after I'd had that near-death, what I now know was a near-death experience in the plane crash, that I had what I call my calling experience, which, just because of time, I won't describe it to you today. I had a very strong mystical experience where I felt called by spirit that now it was time to come out of the closet, that I had a moral responsibility to advocate for people who are having these experiences, because they are being mistreated. They're being called crazy by the medical profession. They are being called crazy by the public. And I know this is not true. And so it was my strong spiritual calling in 1990 to come out of the closet. And that's when I publicly specialized my medical practice in the counseling and research of patients who'd had diverse types of spiritually transformative experiences. Now, I knew that I might be challenged by the medical profession and in specializing in an area like this, but I was ready. The spiritual calling was just so strong. But through the grace of God, I managed to go through all of those hurdles. And then this became my specialty. And then the patients came, the patients came, the patients came. So this is how I now became the first Canadian medical doctor to specialize in spiritually transformative experiences. Now, I'm very quickly, Adir, how are we doing for time? How much more time do I have?
Great. Really, another 25 minutes, or even as long as you want, really.
Okay, good. Then I'll keep going. I wrote books about this, and I started speaking on television, and I was in Canada. I was on television. I was on the cover of some magazines. I was in the newspaper, all over. For whatever reason, Spirit blocked my books coming out in the United States until recently. Such it is. Yeah, I did this work, and I loved it. I loved being a pioneer in the field of advocating for people with spiritually transformative experiences and talking to doctors, talking to the public. But then in November the 8th of 2003, I had a slip and fall accident in Niagara Falls, Ontario, where I fell and hit my head and I died. This was my 5th near-death experience that happened to be, but this is different because this time I died completely. And I had a serious brain injury with a brain hemorrhage. And I instantly felt my spirit whisked out of my body by a force greater than myself. And I was rushing up through this darkness, which some people perhaps call the tunnel. And then I found myself back in that realm of light that I had glimpsed back in 1979 in my near-death experience. But this time I was being welcomed into the realm of light by 2 beings of light, 2 saints that I recognized, saints from my particular spiritual tradition, Paramahansa Yogananda and Mahavatar Babaji. And they mentally or telepathically communicated to me that I had died. And the feeling was of tremendous joy, like a celebration, like a graduation party was being held in my honor for having completed, my assignment or whatever. And I remember I had a little bit of trepidation in my heart because I was thinking, uh-oh, here it comes. I'm going to have my life review now and look at all the things that I didn't do right in my life. But that's not what happened. There was like this wave of unconditional love that came upon me, and this sense like it really didn't matter anymore. That the compassionate understanding, just like as an adult's looking as a child is learning how to walk, and it stumbles and it falls and it bumps its head and it makes mistakes, but that the parent in its love and in its wisdom knows this is all part of the learning process. And so that was what I felt. It's like, oh, don't worry, nobody's perfect, and I just felt such love, such joy, such acceptance. And then I went into this realm of what I call pure consciousness, because I stopped seeing things, but I just was able to take in vast amounts of information all at once. And then in this experience, I suddenly re-remembered. It's like I no longer had forgotten all of my past lives, and I could see how all of my past lives fit together. And it was like the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle finally being put together, and you could see the big picture. And aha, my what I considered rather unusual life as Dr. Yvonne Kason, having all these STEs, it suddenly made sense in the context of my past lives. Guess what? This is not the first lifetime that I've had these types of experiences. So it was a very healing aha experience for me. And then I was given the choice. The 2 beings of light appeared to me again and said mentally to me that you may now choose whether to incarnate in the body of a babe to further serve the divine as a babe, and or to come back to the maimed body. And when I was given that choice in that state of bliss, love, communion that I was on the other side, it was as if my intellect had just sort of gone to sleep, and it was my heart or my soul that was responding. And my heart just instantly responded. It literally felt like it was coming out of my heart. Oh, masters, please guide me. I want to do God's will. What is the higher choice? And then I was so lovingly, how a thought could be loving, but it was so lovingly, the thought came back to me telepathically. It'll be more difficult, but to return to the maimed body. And instantly my heart responded, I accept. And faster than the speed of thought, it was between the thought I and the thought accept, with a gasp of breath, I suddenly woke up in my injured, dead, unconscious body on the ground. And for the first instant, I could see both realms perfectly. I could see the physical world, and I could also see the realm of light with the 2 beings of light. It seemed that they ushered me back into my body, like they were superimposed on each other. And then slowly the realm of light started fading from sight until it just became a little dot. And I was fully back, but I was injured. I had a serious traumatic brain injury with a brain hemorrhage. Again, to make a very long story short, I was totally disabled because of this. I could still walk, I could still move my limbs, etc., but I had such injuries in my brain affecting my frontal lobes and the back of my brain that it disabled me from my ability to practice medicine. And I went to neuro rehab for 7 years trying to get better because I so much loved the work that I did. But I had to accept that in whatever reason in the divine plan that I was meant now to be disabled, and that how I would be able to serve others was not by being out in the world, but through my prayer and my meditation. So I focused very, very much on my inner life, on my prayer and my meditation. And so you might be wondering, gee, if she's so disabled, how come she's now president of Spiritual Awakenings International, writing books and speaking to us today? That's because 12 years after I became disabled, 12 years, more than 12 years, on February 24th, 2016, I had a miraculous healing experience. While I was deep in meditation in that SRF meditation retreat in Encinitas, California, I experienced like a volcano of light erupt in the center of my brain. I could see it inwardly. And the experience I had was literally like the center of my brain had been in darkness for the last 12 years. And suddenly the lights came on and there was this inner feeling of waking up and my brain was healed. And after that healing experience in the first year, I wrote my first draft for 2 new books. So this new book that just came out, Touched by the Light, that's the first book I wrote after my brain healing. And since this time, I've now started public speaking again. I'm not returning to medical practice. I'm over 65, so I figure that's behind me now. Now I'm doing volunteer work. So now I was previously president of IANS, and now I've become president of Spiritual Awakenings International, because the very strong message I was given by Spirit when I was healed was pass on what you have learned. So that's what I'm trying to do, and also with you folks today. So now in our last 20 minutes or so, I'm going to share screen now. I'm going to tell you a little bit. I'm going to shift to some content information and share it with you about spiritually transformative experiences. So spiritually transformative experiences, I coined this phrase back in '94 because these are a vast range of experiences that all cause a spiritual awakening in people. And they all have similar after effects: physical, psychologic, psychic, and spiritual. And there are 6 main types. I'm just going to go right into describing the types. So the first group of spiritually transformative experiences are various types of mystical experiences people are having today. And I found that there seem to be sort of 7 main types. Some would be what I call unitive or communion experiences, where people feel this sense of union or communion with a higher power. Sometimes can be smaller unitive experiences where they're feeling perhaps union with the planet, or sometimes they might feel union with a tree or even union with another person. Some people will have ecstatic or bliss type mystical experiences, where the most profound part of the mystical experience is the incredible joy, the ecstasy, the bliss. Other people will have mystical experiences that are mainly mystical visions. So there's a strong visionary component. And this may be a vision of Abraham, of Moses, of Jesus, of Buddha, of angels, of some spiritual archetype. And sometimes the mystical visions will be compatible with your particular faith of upbringing. But other time, interestingly enough, your mystical visions might be from some other faith tradition. Expansive episodes. This is like what happened to me with my Kundalini awakening, where you feel your sense of consciousness expands in size. And sometimes it's slightly larger than the size of your head. Sometimes it's as large as the room. Sometimes it can get large as the cosmos. Then there are spiritual rebirth or conversion, purification, mystical experiences. And these are ones where people feel like they're being chastened, purified by the higher power, and they come out sometimes with a complete spiritual conversion. The next type is what I call revelations or illuminations. And these are mystical experiences that have a lot of information with them, where people come with new understanding. It could include prophecy. It can include new understandings of the nature of spirit, new spiritual guidance. And then the seventh type of mystical experience is what I call the dissolution experience. And this is the experience, type of mystical experience where the sense of self seems to disappear. And there's no more little I. And it seems as if one dissolves into the infinite. This is very difficult to describe in words. So the second sort of category of spiritually transformative experiences people are having is the spiritual energy experience, which in yoga is called the Kundalini awakening. And if you look in the mystical traditions of all the different paths, including in the Jewish tradition, there are references to a spiritual energy which can have different names. Kundalini awakening, Holy Spirit, Holy Wind. Someone told me Shekinah may also refer to this, but we'll have our rabbi correct me later if I'm incorrect. And the classical symptoms that one experiences with the spiritual energy Kundalini awakening, and this can happen to anyone of any faith tradition or no faith tradition at all, but what they feel is an actual physical symptoms of energy movement. And this can most classically energy up the spine, energy up the body. And this is often associated with inner sounds. These inner sounds can be very variable. Sometimes it's like a roaring, like what I heard, or a rushing of wings is sometimes said, the blowing of wind, it's sometimes described in some of the esoteric texts. Other people may hear ringing of bells or like a gong or an om sound. Some people will get light perceptions where they're feeling inner luminosity or their whole being is luminous. And that this energy rising is associated and leads to either immediately or shortly thereafter, usually either a mystical experience, a profound psychic experience, or a profound creative experience. Now, there are also other STEs, which are various types of psychic or intuitive experiences. I'm just going to go through these very rapidly because I want to make sure we have time for answering questions. Automatic writing. This is when somebody feels like their hand is perhaps taken over by another force and writing something that they're not even conscious of what's coming through them. Other times automatic writing is a little bit different, where people, it's like they can hear it in their head and they're writing down what they're feeling, they're being inspired to write. Channeling, this is a psychic phenomenon where it seems that the personality of the individual steps aside and that another being or entity is speaking through that instrument of that body. Clairvoyance, this is a psychic ability where people can see things that are beyond the normal range of thought. For example, being able to look at another person and to see, where they're having illness in their body, or visions of things that are happening at a remote distance, visions of things that are going to happen in the future, visions of things that happened in the past. Clairsentience, this is when you can sense things that are beyond the normal sensing. So this would be, for example, when people start being able to feel in their own body other people's emotional states because they can feel it as sensations in their own body. And this can also be a sense of knowing, that you just know things about other people by looking at them, or by looking at their picture, that you just automatically know things about them. Clairaudience is when you hear things beyond the normal range of thought. So this might be, one example would be hearing something that somebody said at a remote distance that's important for you to hear, or sometimes hearing guidance from spiritual guides or spiritual helpers. Other psychic abilities, healing abilities. Some people develop the ability to heal through the laying on of hands. Others that find that they develop the ability that just people being in their presence, they experience healing being in their energy field. Many people develop the sense of higher guidance or being able to communicate with spirit guides as a new psychic or intuitive experiences. Mediumship, this is a psychic or intuitive experience where people are able to communicate with spirits of what seems to be deceased individuals. They can often usually both see them and hear them and have a two-way conversation. Out of body experiences, these are experiences where a person feels that their sense of self is no longer in their body, but has risen above their body, or even gone to a remote location where they can accurately see things. Other psychic experiences that some people are experiencing, materialization. This is, some very advanced saints have had the ability to actually materialize objects. And related to this is also the phenomenon of dematerialization. Premonitions or precognition. another psychic phenomenon where people start getting awareness, foreknowledge of things that are going to happen. Past life recall, I found in my clinical work, this is very common. Many people were coming to see me as patients because they were starting to get past life recall, either by meeting somebody that they apparently seem to have known in a past life, or by going to a physical location, and then they suddenly start having memories of having lived at that physical location before in a past life. Telekinesis is the psychic experience where people are able to move objects by their energy field or through thought. Telepathy, that's the psychic experience when you can communicate through thought only. Telepyrokinesis, some people have developed the ability to start a fire with their mind. And then there are trans-dimensional experiences where people have felt like they have communicated or crossed into other dimensions. And I'm just going to say very briefly, some UFO encounters that people are calling abductions seem that they could be trans-dimensional experiences. Now, psychic experiences are not always positive and spiritual. So, you know, a mystical experience or a Kundalini awakening leads to a very positive or spiritual experience, but psychic experiences are not always positive. That according to yoga and Buddhism, they understand there may be lower astral planes and that we might access those and have some frightening experiences. I'm just going to move on because of time. The next kind of STE is the inspired creative experience, inspired creativity and genius. And this is a powerful creative experience that is mixed with a mystical experience. And if you look through history, you will see that there are many people that are known primarily as mystics, but they've had tremendous inspired creativity, written tremendous volumes of work. One example would be Paramahansa Yogananda, who's known primarily as a yogic mystic and saint, but he wrote 17 books. So, you know, it's quite outstanding. And then there are also geniuses who are known primarily for their genius, who also had mystical experiences. So one would be Einstein, who wrote about mystical experiences. Another one would be Brahms, as two examples. Now the near-death experience. So the near-death experience, what is this? The near-death experience is an out-of-body experience and or white light mystical experience. And also it happens when a person is close to death or clinically dead or facing imminent death or severe trauma. Now, I want to point out here, you have to have both in order for it to be a near-death experience. So if you have an out-of-body experience when you're sitting meditating or praying, that's an out-of-body experience. It's not a near-death experience because you're not close to death. Similarly, if you have a close call, like you know, somebody, I read the story online, somebody was out surfing and a shark came and bit the end of their surfboard, and then they made it safely to shore and they said, boy, I had a near-death experience. But when you asked, you know, did you go out of body or did you have a mystical experience when you had this close call? No, they did not. So really, they are incorrectly using the term near-death experience. It's a close call or a brush with death. It's only called a near-death experience if during that close call or during that brush with death, you have either the out-of-body and or the white light type of mystical experience. And this can happen to people when they're clinically dead and then resuscitated during close calls, but also when they're facing death. Like this has happened to people. I've heard several stories now from people on the battlefield where, for example, one veteran, Vietnam War veteran, told me that a grenade landed in front of him and he thought he was going to die. And he instantly went out of body and he found himself back in the USA. He seemed to be floating above where his wife and children were asleep in bed. And then all of a sudden he got nudged by one of his buddies on the battlefield. The grenade didn't go off. It was a dud. And when this person came to me and he says, well, you know, the grenade never went off. I mean, was that a near-death experience? I say, absolutely, yes, it was a near-death experience. So facing trauma, we can also have these. Near-death experiences have been reported for centuries. It's not a new thing. The term is new. The term was coined by Raymond Moody back in the 1970s, but they've been reported for years. This painting was painted in the 1500s, and it seems to depict people going through a tunnel being accompanied by some sort of angels. So, and other people say the Tibetan Book of the Dead and even the Egyptian Book of the Dead referred to near-death experiences. So the phenomenon of the transition into death and the near-death experience for people who've resuscitated have been around for centuries. And we do have some good research. I wanted to share this statistic with you. Dr. Pim van Lommel in Holland did a very excellent study of cardiac arrest patients that were having procedures where they often had cardiac arrests. And he discovered that patients that were documented dead, you know, they had flatline for a period of time before they resuscitated, 1 in 8 reported this out-of-body or white light mystical experience when they'd had a near-death experience. And near-death experiences, they can happen at every stage of life and from all sorts of events. People have remembered having them in the womb during very difficult childbirth, while they were neonates in the incubator, cardiac arrest at any time of life, difficult surgeries, near drowning accidents, severe illnesses where they had a high fever, all sorts of accidents, car accidents, plane accidents, train accidents, near miss accidents, electrocutions, being hit by lightning, allergic reactions. I just want to mention here, diabetic patients have sometimes had this with their sugar reactions, in combat, facing death. And there are 3 types of near-death experiences: the out-of-body type, which is primarily floating above the body and watching what happens to your body. The doctor's trying to resuscitate, and sometimes the next room with your loved ones. Then there seems a second type, which is those that go on often through the tunnel into the light, sometimes having a life review. This is the mystical type of white light near-death experience, which is the most transforming type of near-death experience. But there's a third type that I also want to point out, is that there are some people that have a distressing type of near-death experience, that they sometimes experience it as distressing because as they're feeling themselves coming out of their body, they don't want to die. They're fighting against it. They feel like they're swimming against a riptide. They're trying to get back into their body while they're feeling that pull towards the light. So when they are resuscitated, they don't describe it as a beautiful experience. It was horrible. They felt they were struggling all the time. Then there are other ones who seem to go to this low astral planes where they seem to be encountering dark entities. And, you know, these would be described as hellish experiences. Some people have reported these. And interestingly enough, if one very classic case, Howard Storm had one of these very dark, tormenting type of near-death experiences. And the thought occurred to him while he was in this darkness that he should pray. But he was an atheist and he didn't believe in praying and he didn't want to pray, but the thought kept on coming to his mind to pray, and he started to pray. He was raised a Christian, and he only thing he could remember was a song he'd learned in his childhood called Jesus Loved Me. He doesn't even remember the words, but he just sang a few lines from it. He started singing it. And eventually what ended up happening was he felt a beam of light coming down and sort of rescuing him and pulling him up out of the darkness. And then he ended up in the white light realm, and he had a complete spiritual conversion, and in fact became a pastor afterwards. So even a low astral NDE can convert to a white light NDE by turning to the light. And then other people have nightmare-like distortions that sort of remind me of what an LSD bad trip might be. And I wonder if that might be related to some of the drugs in their system, if this happens under surgery, or some of the toxins when they're very, very sick. And I just want to mention one last point. Some people are distressed by their near-death experience, not because there was anything bad about the near-death experience, but because they don't want to be back. They're really angry that they were sent back because it was so much nicer on the other side, that they come back to a very unhappy and abusive situation, or past being disabled. So these are distressing near-death experiences. Now I'm just going to wrap up with other death-related STEs. I was hoping to say more, but obviously I've talked longer than I should. But I want to talk about the other death-related STEs a little bit, and then we're going to wrap up for questions. So There's three types. First is the deathbed visions, or what is also called nearing death awareness. And this has again been described for years and years and years. And this is where people, before they actually die, the person before they die, and this often happens for a few days, sometimes it's a few hours, but it can be as much as a few weeks before a person actually dies, where they have experiences where it seems as if the veil between this side and the other side is thin, and they may see departed loved ones. They may start talking to departed loved ones. Often they lose their fear of death. They may even tell their family they're ready to die. So this is deathbed visions or nearing death awareness, very transformative, and happens to a person before they actually die. The second type is the death watch experience or shared death experience. And this happens when somebody else dies at the moment that they die. I'm going to talk about that more in my next slide. And then the third category is the after-death communication. And the after-death communication is the STE, where it seems the spirit of someone who's passed, maybe days, weeks, months, or even years earlier, that they are striving to communicate with the living. And they can communicate in many ways. They may appear to you. They may make an object in front of you move. They may turn the radio on and their favorite song is on in the radio. You may smell the smell of their perfume. You may smell the smell of their cigar. So after death communications can occur in a number of different ways. But this is a person who's deceased communicating with someone who's living. So let the death watch experience at the time that someone else dies, I have found to be extremely common. And it's more common if you're right next, very physically close to someone at the moment that they die. But it can also happen to you if you're far away from somebody who dies, if you're emotionally close to them, if there's a bond of love that connects you. And it's also very common if you are receptive to STEs. And there are many types of death watch experiences that can happen right at the time that somebody else dies. Now, some people describe something very NDE-like, as if they shared in the death experience. One woman told me she was holding her husband's hand, and at the moment that he died, all of a sudden she found herself out of body with him. They were both out of body. They were still holding hands, and they were rising up through this tunnel towards the light, and she was going with him, looking at the light. And then all of a sudden it was like she hit a force field. He kept on going. He kept on going into the light, and then she couldn't go any further. And then she found herself coming back to her awareness at the bedside, holding her husband's hand, and she realized that her husband had now departed. So that would be the NDE-like or the shared death type of death watch experience. Then other people have body symptom death watch experiences where they develop in their physical body the physical symptoms that their loved one has at the moment of their death. For example, someone who dies with a head injury, you might feel a sudden blow, searing headache. A woman told me that at the moment her father died of a heart attack, he was traveling in Europe and she was here in Toronto. She got crushing chest pain and shortness of breath. And then her father's face popped in her eye and she thought, oh my goodness, has my dad had a heart attack? Sure enough, at that moment, he had died of a heart attack. Death watch visions, this is very common too. And this is where at the moment of the other person's death that you see something. So if you're at the bedside, some people have reported seeing an orb of light, like a ball of light, leaving the body of their loved one at their moment of death. Sometimes people actually visually see like a wispy spirit of their loved one leaving their body at their moment of death. Other people have told me that they've seen like an angel or some sort of spirit that was going to accompany their loved one out of their body, standing at the bedside of their loved one right before their moment of death, and then the two of them going together. And then other times, if you're at a great distance from the person, you might get an image of that dying person's face come into your mind right at their moment of death. Or to me, it happened with my grandfather. I was asleep and he came to me like in a dream. I saw my grandfather's face, young and luminous, and I knew intuitively that my grandfather had died. Another person told me he was driving to visit his dying mother at a hospital. But before he could make it to the hospital, all of a sudden in his rear view mirror, he saw his mother's face appear to him in his rear view mirror, and he knew intuitively that his mother had died. Other people can have more auditory death watch experiences where they hear a message from the deceased person at their moment of death. A fifth type is what I call the brushed by an angel type of death watch experience, where when you're at the bedside of someone who passes, that right at their moment of death, you feel like maybe an angel that came to greet them brushed you, and you get catapulted into a deep spiritual experience. This is often most pronounced if you have the great blessing of being at the bedside of a very spiritual person when they die. And then the last type is the ushering death watch experience, where many people have reported, and it's actually happened to me, I write about it in my book, when suddenly you feel at the moment of someone else's death that you're pulled out of your body, you find yourself on the other side and the other soul is confused, and you know intuitively that you're being asked by spirit to help usher that person into the light. So I'm going to wrap with that. I'm going to say after the spiritual awakening, many people start having many types of STEs. There are many physical after effects. There are many psychological after effects, most of them positive. There can be psychic after effects, spiritual after effects. There can be challenging after effects. I'm going to take a minute here before we wrap up, that sometimes there can be difficulties in relationships after one person in the relationship has had an STE with a spiritual awakening and the other person hasn't, because really the person who's had the STEs is a changed person and their perspectives have changed. So this is something that needs to be worked through in relationships. There can be confusion, anxiety, fear of being labeled crazy, and challenges relating to unblocking of memories that often happens. So I'm now going to wrap. How can we help each other and people who are having these types of experiences? So number one, we should listen to people with respect and humility and love as they tell us these experiences, that it's important to them. People often have a very strong need to share. And secondly, validate the experience. It's real. Even if we've never experienced, it's real for them, and it's very, very powerful. So validate it. This is a real thing that happened to them. If you're able to help educate them, to give them the names, suggest, hey, you know, this Dr. Yvonne Kason's written a book and she's got this new website, Spiritual Awakenings International. Maybe that'll help you figure out what to call your experience. And to refer them to support. Rabbi Glick, for example, seems to be quite knowledgeable. He would be somebody who might be able to help people who've had some of these experiences, or to other sources, to people who would be supportive to the experiencer. So I'm just going to end now. This is my book in case you're interested. And this is my website, spiritualawakeningsinternational.org. And I invite all of you, I write more about spiritually transformative experiences and their after effects there. And we have speakers. So with that, I'm going to wrap up, and I would be happy to answer any questions anybody has.
Thank you so very much. Wonderful. Such a fullness of a presentation. And we usually have so many questions coming through the chat, but your initial talking about your life was so riveting. There wasn't a single question. I think everybody was just listening to your life story. Thank you for sharing that. And I think we'll just go straight to questions, because I'm sure people have a lot of questions. I see 3 in the chat. And I will, and if anybody has a question and would like to ask it, you can also unmute yourself. But first, we'll take a few questions in the chat. I'll read them out. So Alan, you answered this a little bit at the very end, but Alan Perez asks, once people have a first experience, are they likely to have more? Are they more receptive?
The answer to that is yes. I went over that very quickly at the end, but it's a spirit. The first STE that people have is a spiritual awakening experience. So it's a beginning. And that most people who have their first awakening experience go on to have more spiritually transformative experiences. And that may be affected by how much they're embracing their personal spiritual practice. So if you are praying and meditating regularly, that seems to make it even more likely that you will have more types of spiritually transformative experiences. And most people go on to have many types of spiritually transformative experiences. So even if your first one, I now realize that my first STE this lifetime was a near-death experience I had as a child when I was 5 years old. I didn't realize that for many years because I didn't think of it as a 5-year-old. I thought when I was out of body, I was flying, and I used to think I could fly. So there you go. But I now realize it was a near-death experience when I was almost hit by a train. And so that was my first STE, but I then went on later in life to have, yes, more near-death experiences. And I went on to have a Kundalini awakening, and I went on to have psychic phenomena, and I went on to have almost all of the things I talked to you about today. That's why the good Lord prepared me for helping other people with these experiences by giving them to me as well.
Thank you. And then Anita asks, does the research show any relationship between faith and STE? And if so, which faiths have the most STEs?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I don't know that anybody has actually done that study. But what I can tell you is that I have personally spoken with people of every faith I can imagine that I know about who've had STEs. I mean, and in my practice, I'm saying in my practice, I've had more than one Jewish rabbi come up to me and tell me they've had STEs. People from the Jewish faith, absolutely. People who are raised in the Christian faith, absolutely. People raised as Muslims, yes. People raised in Buddhist, yes. People raised as Hindus, yes. Native Indians, yes. Sikhs, yes. So to me, it's a universal human phenomenon that we are all spiritual beings, that we are all children of the same one creator, regardless of whichever culture or faith tradition we are born into. We all have this potential to awaken to our true spiritual nature and to have deeper spiritual experiences. Yeah.
Thank you. I have 3 questions about animals, so I'm going to group them together. The first one is, can you comment about experiences with animals and pets? Then from Rachel, opinions about animals as a vector of communication from past loved ones. And then finally, from Carol, do animals ever have the ability to experience visions? After my daughter's 30-year-old parrot died, her dog went to the corner where his case was and stood there at attention for about 5 minutes. When she checked with the vet, he confirmed that this was the time that the bird's body was cremated.
Interesting questions. I like these questions. I invite you to go to the SAI website because I have a whole section in there on animal encounters because I've had this come up so frequently. So let me just say a few things about animal encounters, and I hope I answer all of your questions. First off, number one, absolutely, it appears that animals also cross over into the light, that it's not just people that go into astral heavens after their death. My good friend Robert Baer, who is the vice president of Spiritual Awakenings International, when he had his near-death experience, he's had 2. One of them, his first one, when he was over in the light and in the presence of the higher power, he saw his deceased dog. It was his deceased dog, who he loved very much, was there. So that's very heartening to know. So a second question was about animals being a medium for communication, and can they see spirits? I have had many people tell me that they think their pet is able to see spirits. So this is not the first time that I've heard this. And I mean, this is, how are you going to prove that? We have no way to prove that. But I'll just give an example. Somebody that I know who has a multiple STE experiencer, who's had many STEs of all kinds. He is also a very strong medium. So he will often have spirits come to him at night, and he tries to speak with them and help guide them into the light. But he says this one dog that he had, whenever a spirit would come, the dog knew. The dog would come by his feet, and wouldn't want to be away from his feet and would be looking right at, like would be staring right at where the spirit is. So so he's absolutely convinced that his dog was able to see spirits on the other side. Now the third question was about a dog being a medium for someone else to communicate. Could you repeat that question, Rabbi?
Yeah, it's in your chat. If you look at, if you press a button chat, do animals have the ability to experience vision? So that was the first part. Then after my daughter's 30-year-old parrot died, her dog went to the corner where his case was and stood there for 5 minutes. And that was the exact precise time when the dog was being cremated, when the parrot was being cremated.
I would say there's a good possibility. You know, I can't prove it one way or the other, but I would say there's a good possibility. If my friend's dog could see it when a spirit came, why would this dog, who probably loved the parrot, you know, there was that connection of love, and how I said, you know, humans have death watch experiences right at the time that someone else dies, when there's that connection of love. Why would the dog not feel it with the parrot if he loved the parrot? I just want to share here, I had death watch experiences when 2 of my cats died. I loved my cats very, very much, and I was heartbroken when they died. But at their moment of death, the one of them, I saw her like running into the light, and she was running into some being of light's arms, some woman's arms, and it actually gave me great comfort that I saw my beloved cat going off into the light. So, you know, could a dog see this? Possibly, yes.
Thank you. So I guess we'll open it up to anybody else. Anybody have any questions they'd like to unmute themselves or put into the chat?
Blanca has her waving her hand.
All right, does she? Okay, Blanca, go ahead.
Well, first of all, I want to say thank you for all of your unconditional love to all of us in the family of light that you have come to give us today. And thank you for giving us, through the Shekinah of the Divine Spirit, the initiation of fire in all of our hearts. That is the love of God to all of us. So I'm going to share now about the death experience of my Chihuahua, who happened to pass away during our very difficult times that we've been going through. She passed away, and when she passed away, I was heartbroken, and I meditated 3 days after. She came to me and she showed me that she was a 16-year-old who had reincarnated as a Chihuahua. She also told me that her name was Nora. She also called me Mommy by and via my husband bringing me home for Mother's Day cake with the little plastic things that they put on top of the cakes saying Mama, Mama, Mama. Throughout having my Chihuahua for 16 years, she always showed me, look at this book, and it had a Mama quote, or look at this image, it had a Mommy quote. So I ended up being able to see my Chihuahua crossing over the Rainbow Bridge. And she also told me, I didn't cross it over walking, I crossed it over flying, because I turned into a light being also, meaning the energy transmutated. And then in my other meditation, I saw her that she was a girl, that she had died in a previous accident, whom her name was Nora, and who was very happy that I was her mom. And because I used to take my Chihuahua, believe it or not, to the playground, and we used to go together down the slide and the toddler spot, you know, for the little kiddies. And I would have her in the swing, and I treated her very much, you know, like if she was my daughter. So she came back and she told me, thank you. So I totally understand about the transmutation of energy, and animals do communicate with us, because my cats were all over her spots, her favorite spots, and they still are and go to the spots, you know, because we still remember her and we communicate with her every day, and we welcome her energy to be with us, you know, because energy is eternal. You can never lose your energy because it transmutes. It only, you can shift it and change it, but you can never lose it. So to that, just to the enlightenment of what you just given it, you know, to all of us, I thank you for all of your knowledge and the love that you're giving us today. That's my very own personal experience, and a very deep experience, because my Chihuahua lives to be 16 years old. And to me, she was with me from when I was single up until when I became a married woman. And to me, she was my everything. She was with me in every single stage of my life. So animals understand that, believe me. They do. They are with us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Blanca.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if you can see this last question from Susan. An interesting question. this work brings us so many questions, such as about experiences as opposed to reality, and living that question. I have heard explanation for these experiences as neurological phenomenon, not spiritual. So I'm sure you've had that question come up a lot. And
Yes. Yes. Thank you for the question, Susan. Was it Susan Stevens that asked the question?
It is, yes.
Yeah. Hi, Susan.
Hello.
Yeah. You know, there are people who are staunch materialists. And we have a lot of them in our society, and they don't believe that anything to do with spirit or spirituality is real. And that's just a reality. That's part of the world that we live in. And so, you know, once you've had some of these experiences and you've experienced how profoundly transforming they are, you know, if you look at mystics throughout history, you know, many of them have been persecuted and put to death because of their beliefs, but they are so absolutely certain about their convictions. When you've had one of these experiences, it's like it's etched in your soul. Mystical experiences, they change you, they transform you. So if people don't believe you, people don't believe you. But that being said, what is some of the evidence that we have for the scientific mind who doesn't want to believe people who have had these profound experiences? So some of the research that's been done that is proving that this is not just, you know, brain firing, giving you hallucinations, is relating to near-death experiences. So there's been quite a bit of research into what people have observed while they were out of body. So while they were out of body with their near-death experience, and they floated to, you know, first off, what they observed while they were out of body, when they were supposedly dead, right, or supposedly unconscious, how could they have accurately seen what their doctors were doing? How could they accurately have heard what their doctors have said? How could they have accurately reported what people were doing in the next room? How could they accurately have reported what people were doing 3 rooms away? I'm going to give you one example, for instance, just as an example. Again, this is Robert Baer, who's the vice president of Spiritual Awakenings International, that in his near-death experience, what happened 11 years ago when he had a massive heart attack, he was clinically dead for 45 minutes, just so you know. His second one, he was dead, I think he said, for about 10 minutes. So while he was dead in the 10-minute one, he left his body and he went several rooms away. He found himself several rooms away where there were hospital staff who were looking for his ID. They were going through his pants and his shirt, whatever, looking for his wallet. And once they found his wallet, trying to find the compartment where he keeps his, I guess, his health insurance information that they needed at the hospital. And he has it hidden sort of in a little secret compartment in his wallet. And he says he remembers distinctly trying to talk to them, look in that little compartment. Then he realized, oh, I must be dead because they can't hear me. But they were several rooms away. They were not in the room where his body was clinically dead and the doctors were trying to resuscitate him. Anyway, so the doctors did resuscitate him. And afterwards, he talked to his medical doctor about what he had seen. And his doctor said, just a minute, I'm going to get the people into the room. So he got these 2 people and he brought them into the room and he said, Robert, are these the 2 people that you saw? And he said, yes. And so then Robert told them exactly what he overheard them saying to each other and exactly what they were doing. And everybody was just stunned because it was 100% accurate. Now, I'm just giving that as one example, but there have been many research studies. These are called veridical perceptions, or this is perceptions that people had while they were out of body, that there's no way they could have known that. It is physically impossible for them to have seen that unless their point of perception had actually moved to where they say their point of perception moved to. So that would be one argument that I would say to that person who says that your mind created that. Well, how did the mind know what happened 3 rooms away?
So I think we have, thank you so much. I think we have time for maybe 2 more questions. One from Amy: what predisposes people who have near-death experiences compared with those with near death and no spiritual experience?
Okay, that's an interesting question. And I would have to say at this point, we don't really know. We don't really know why some people have near-death experiences and why other people don't. There have been other times that I've been close to death in my life and I did not have a near-death experience at those times. But then there were times that I was and I did. Do I think that if you've previously had an STE and previously had a near-death experience, that makes you more open or more susceptible to having more? Yes. Okay, so if you've had one STE, I think you are more predisposed to a near-death experience, but doesn't mean you're going to have one every time. Mhm.
Now, final question from Jill. Hi and thanks. Do you find that the people with these experiences are somehow more primed or receptive to them? Or do you also find that people who describe themselves as not spiritual or not into meditation have had NDEs or STEs?
Oh, both are true. Both are true. Okay, so both are true. So first off, if you are primed, as you put it, so that if you've embraced your spiritual path and you are praying regularly, and particularly if you've started a regular meditation practice, that I have found in my research that meditation seems to be the strongest trigger to incite people to have some sort of STE. So there is a truth, definitely. If you've sort of primed or prepared yourself, it makes you more open, it makes you more susceptible to STEs. However, however, there are also people, and I have some cases of that in my book, where people out of the blue and totally unexpectedly have like a conversion experience. One fellow I wrote about an elderly gentleman. He was walking home from work one night back in the 1940s or 1950s, and he just got stopped by a force field of light. And you may now choose. And he had to now choose whether he was going to live a life filled with faith or not, which really there's no choice when you have that sort of an experience come upon you. And he had a complete spiritual conversion based on this experience. And before he was, I think his father had been some sort of religious figure, a pastor or something like that. And he had reacted and gone the opposite direction. He became an atheist, agnostic. He didn't believe in any of that religious crap, he said. But then with this experience, he had a complete conversion. So, and I've heard other stories of people having experiences that are truly, truly a spiritual awakening, catching them by surprise, that they were not expecting a spiritual awakening. And this can be triggered by anything from sometimes the death of a loved one, sometimes maybe looking at a beautiful scene of nature, sometimes falling in love, sometimes it happens coming upon scripture or seeing a face of a saint. I mean, there can be many triggers, and other times just out of the blue, walking home from work one night and oh my goodness, they have a mystical experience that profoundly changes the course of their life.
So I think we're going to wrap up here, and I'd just like to thank you again and for your expertise and your warmth and sharing so openly with us, your story and your research. And that so many thoughts come up in my own mind as you were talking. From our tradition, and we have so many stories in our Talmud about rabbis who have these experiences. But maybe what came to mind the most was the experiences of the prophet Ezekiel. And Ezekiel's prophecies are the basis of Jewish mysticism. We read of them in synagogue several times during the year. They're the topic of so much of our later commentary. And when he first has his experiences, he says, and with a rush or with a roar, I start. And that's what when you were talking about that, it made me think of, it just correlated perfectly in the sense of expanse. And then he tries to describe whatever he is seeing, which we've been trying to decipher since then. But thank you for sharing and for being with us today. And thank you everybody for all of your questions and for being part of our program. To everybody on Facebook. We'll have a recording available if anybody would like to watch at a later date. So thank you again.
Thank you for having me. It was wonderful being with you all.
Good to be with you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rabbi, for holding this conversation. Fabulous.
Thank you. Thank you for being here with us. Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Bye.